Well, welcome to this session on strategic security for a quantum reality. The past couple days, I've spent a lot of time on the showroom floor talking to the various vendors about what their plans are for post-quantum. And this word quantum does sound a little bit science fiction, a little bit like something we don't really have to worry about just yet, a little bit intangible. I'm guessing that all of you are here today because you realize that it is tangible and it is something that we should be starting to talk about. And in fact, we have in the DoD a deadline, a couple deadlines approaching. By 2030, NIST is going to begin deprecating any sort of quantum vulnerable solution. And by 2035, it will be disallowed. And in fact, the DoD has a strict timeline for transitioning to quantum resilience by 2035 as well. So that brings us here today. We have all these great new quantum technologies at our fingertips, and even more than on this list emerging. We have quantum sensing, quantum timing, quantum networking, quantum computing, all sorts of advantages, and it sounds like a world of opportunity. Now, under quantum computing, we have even more advantages. And then this one little line where we use it to break cryptography. And now that's a downside. So instead of just defensive or added capabilities, we now have a risk factor that quantum computers can be used for offensive. So today, I want to walk you through a bigger picture of this, of what quantum resilience means, and across both of the emerging technologies and the ones that we have today. And so the next year, when I walk around the floor, talking to vendors about quantum resilience, everyone will have fantastic solutions available, and of course, just a mere 1 or 2 months after that, we'll be ready to deploy them and go through acquisition, and maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's start at the very beginning. What is a quantum threat, and what is it going to mean for cryptography? Well, a quantum computer isn't going to simply break all of cryptography. That's the good news. But the cryptography that it will break happens to be intrinsic for all of our communications today. That includes code signing, emails, internet, your pacemaker, you name it. And in fact, if you remember not too long ago, around 2018, there was a lot of news about how fitness apps and fitness tracking devices were being used across the DoD, and that was actually leaking information about location of troops. And so then there was a lot of hardening of that information to make sure that it was restricted and better encrypted. Now, of course, with a quantum computer, all that is then exposed again. And not only that, but all sorts of similar information. So information that in itself may not seem particularly sensitive, but now can be aggregated and used offensively. So particular aspects that quantum computers can break include things like key establishment, how we get keys and move them around. We can also break digital signatures, which allows us to forge data and claim that someone said something or did something that they didn't. We can also impersonate people, or impersonate units, and have undetected unauthorized access, because it will look just like the real entity. That's not great, but to make matters worse, this is not an emerging threat. This is a retroactive threat, which means once the quantum computer becomes a reality, it will suddenly be able to break things that are being collected and sent right now today. What does this look like? Here is an example, one theoretical example. Suppose it takes us 11 years to develop a quantum computer. Okay, and then after that, the adversary can start breaking data, the data it's collecting today. Well, assuming this was their timeline and we start deploying quantum-resistant cryptography today in quantum-resistant systems, that will mean some testing time, because of course we need to integrate these and define out how our protocols work and all of that stuff. Then we're going to go through an acquisition process. I'm going to be very optimistic here and say that that will take us a mere 1 to 2 years. Then, of course, that solution will have to be tested in the actual use case. So not simply testing its functionality from a computer sort of point of view, but how is this used in practice in the missile system, for example. And then, of course, we need to deploy that rotation, schedule it, and arrange it, and roll out this adjustments. And all of that takes time. So assuming it takes us, say, 8 to 12 years to do that process, and we have data that's sensitive for a longer period of time, hence why we're encrypting it. Maybe it's sensitive for a year, maybe it's sensitive for 25 years. That means you are actually losing data today, even though it is encrypted and even though we do not have a cryptographically relevant quantum computer here with us in the room, that data is considered lost. And of course, if you're tracking this and you have the 2035 deadline from NIST, 11 years is not the time span that we're looking at. We need to be moving this even faster. And if you are looking at any of the high side information, you will be feeling this heat even more so. So, we've got a problem. What do we do about it? Well, we have new solutions coming at us. Do we need to change those? We have our current networks. Do we need to change those? Well, let's go through a walkthrough. First off, we have quantum sensing, quantum timing. And this does not exist of all quantum technologies. I'm going to run through some. Now, things like quantum sensing and quantum timing, they're how to use a quantum computer to do a particular functionality. It's not inherently meant to provide security. So, by default, whatever security is considered in addition and separately to that. And so it doesn't mean that we don't need to secure it. It's simply an extra layer and done separately. So let's move on from that one. I'm going to skip to the computing aspects. We have traditional computing today, whether that's in the cloud or on an Excel sheet. And we have quantum computing. Now, normally when we talk about computing, that is data in process. You're doing some sort of computation on it, hence the name. And if you go back a couple decades, we'd often say, data in process is in the clear. We don't protect that. Of course, that's not the reality today. Today, we can actually protect and encrypt data while it's being processed. Some of these methods are called homomorphic encryption, or private set intersection, and private information retrieval. Different versions of these provide different attributes. So, for example, I can encrypt data and then compute on it, and I can upload that encrypted data to a cloud and then access it while it's encrypted and have my computations done and only pull down the result. That's homomorphic encryption. I could also put data in the clear in the cloud, and then I can hide how I access it. So even the cloud itself does not know what information there I'm retrieving. And that's private information retrieval. So there's methods to protect these, and we are beginning to see quantum versions of these, like a post-quantum homomorphic encryption. But that is fairly nascent. And since that is not, most of our information about how to do quantum resilience is inherited into that data in process, I'm actually going to skip data in process as well and tell you there's some things that are growing out there, but let's focus on our biggest issues, our biggest cores. Now, data at rest is one of those. And how we handle data at rest for quantum computing is a little bit different than how we do it for traditional computing. And in fact, if you're tracking quantum networking, often we will take data on a traditional platform and then talk about transmitting select information with the quantum side. So let's move on to the networking then, because getting this right ends up being inherited by the rest. So we need to do something about our traditional networks and devices, and we also need to do something about quantum networking, presumably, because it's supposed to do something with security, right? All right, so here's where security is really standing out. What do we do about it? There are three main categories when it comes to quantum resilience that have been proposed today. One of them is quantum key distribution, or quantum cryptography. And this is basically, how do we use this new technology to do other new things? So can we use the new technology to prevent access by its same adversarial component? We also have symmetric key distribution. Now, symmetric keys have been around for basically since the beginning of cryptography, where we hand-delivered things, or maybe you can think of your black box hand delivery. And of course, we use key-filled devices and so on today. And we are seeing various options being proposed where we use a symmetric key distribution. Kerberos protocol, for example, is one of those. And that one has been around for a long time. And then we have post-quantum cryptography. Let me run through this list and take it one by one. So, quantum key distribution. Very interesting innovation. The NSA came out with a statement about quantum key distribution. And since we're going to keep this to the right classification, obviously, I'm going to read what they are saying here and provide some highlight on why they're saying this. So, what they say, the actual security provided by a quantum key distribution system is not the theoretical unconditional security from the laws of physics as modeled and often suggested, but rather the more limited security that can be achieved by hardware and engineering designs. Specific hardware used to perform quantum key distribution can introduce vulnerabilities. What does this mean? Quantum key distribution, in a nutshell, if you're not familiar, is talking about superposition of qubits, of quantum bits. And the idea being that if an eavesdropper tries to listen to this channel that has quantum qubits in transmission, it will actually change the quantum state. Therefore, you cannot possibly have an eavesdropper without both the sender and receiver knowing about it. Sounds really good on the physics side. But of course, when we talk about physics and engineering, there's this kind of idea of perfection. And I'm going to draw an analogy here from what we have seen already in biometrics. Biometrics are often also considered very perfect. Your DNA is extremely unique to you. Your fingerprint is unique to you. So that should be unbreakable, right? Well, when we actually do a biometric scan, so for example, of a fingerprint, if we do a biometric scan of a fingerprint, you're not actually cross-comparing the whole fingerprint and its entire uniqueness to you. If you're talking about FBI database comparison, you're only matching about 12 points and looking for 12 possible similarities. Sometimes you only match 6 points. If you remember when the iPhone was rolled out and people were having trouble doing fingerprint access to their iPhone when we first allowed fingerprint access, there was a lot of backlash because people were having trouble accessing their device. And then suddenly everything changed and all of that went away and people were happily accessing their iPhones. What happened there? Well, they were rolling out a biometric where they were testing more points, but because there was more points of comparison, people weren't getting the access into their iPhone that they wanted. So what Apple changed is they rolled that down to only check for 3 points of commonality for your whole fingerprint. And they were defining that 3 points was unique enough. And suddenly everyone was happy because they could access their phone without any problems. Of course, their neighbor could probably also access their phone without any problems. But they went to a baseline, and they tried to increase it afterwards. But you can see here an analogy where the concept, the scientific perfection, is a true statement, but when we actually make the engineering decisions, multiple choices are made in the process that change the security reality. And the NSA is really pointing out a similar type of concept here for quantum key distribution. It is not that the physics don't work, they work. It's not that we can't transmit qubits, it's fantastic, there's lots of good innovation happening there. But we need to be very careful of the engineering choices because a lot of other things are going in that affect security. Now, the NSA in their public statement also highlighted a few other things. A denial of service. If we talk about an eavesdropper trying to listen in on the channel, and the very fact of listening in changes the transmission, that means it's trivial to deny service. It's trivial to jam. I don't even have to try to read anything, I just act like I'm listening in and it'll self-jam, which may not work in all instances. There's also an aspect of authentication. Quantum key distribution does not provide any entity authentication. You do not know who you're talking to. But you can achieve that through classic cryptographic means added on. Now, those classic means essentially mean that we already have a shared key, which defeats the point of using quantum service to distribute that. So there's various aspects here that NSA is pointing out for security. And why I highlight this is there's also some confusion about what it means for having quantum resilience versus using quantum technologies for that. Quantum key distribution is actually very useful. It is fantastic for scientific research. And it can be used for defense in depth, as we do go for quantum resilience. We just need to be very careful. Being a cryptographer, I'm fully aligned here, and seeing also some of the high-side stuff, I'm fully aligned here on what the NSA is putting out in their public statement, that we need to be careful relying on this as a core distribution mechanism for any sort of key using cryptography. So is it fantastic as an added or an additional layer, or as an additional key injected, but it is not how we distribute keys as a main core component. Now, this might raise questions as to what about quantum networking? Does this change quantum networking? Because we, of course, often use QKD in quantum networking. And quantum networking is more than QKD. It's this bigger picture, and sometimes we talk about syncing quantum clocks with it. So that has a security in addition, and it's added separately. And once again, quantum networking does provide this defense in depth. We can add it to our traditional channels. All right, so we have this fantastic add-on potential, but we still need to solve a core problem. So what do we do about that? Let's keep going down our list. Symmetric key distribution. I mentioned things like the Kerberos protocol, or if you use pre-shared keys. This is also a challenge and an issue, mostly because of modeling the trust aspects in the threat model. Where are those keys stored? Who has access to them? We already have issues today with manual distribution of keys. And those are the keys that are distributed by the NSA with a long chain of custody and very careful management. So if we start generating pre-shared symmetric keys from each vendor, it would become a problem. So that is also not our core method. Even if we talk about Kerberos method today, that is used within a very confined setting, like within your laptop. And that brings us to post-quantum. Unsurprisingly, within this process over the last several years to find and design and standardize post-quantum algorithms and an NSA support behind that, this is where a lot of the focus rests. This doesn't mean that it is absolutely perfect or we know for certain that there will never be an attack method, but we do know for certain that it's going to be a lot better than the other two. So, what do we do about that? Well, quantum computing has continued to increase at rapid rates, and we are also seeing lots of rollout of guidance alongside that. So as early as 2021, we had our first big guidance come out, and we are currently in the draft stage of the DoD post-quantum strategy, in which we expect to be released quite soon. Alongside that, we have quantum computer development. If you know about cryptography and how we analyze cryptography, cryptography is assessed on the inability to break what we call computationally hard problems. What quantum supremacy means, which is this right up here, quantum supremacy means that, in this case, Google was able to break such a hard problem. That doesn't mean it was the hard problem that underpins cryptography, but it was the first break. And then, of course, shortly after that, which I'll note is now almost 5 years ago, we have China also achieving quantum supremacy. And it has continued to increase since then. So quantum computers are coming. It is now in a refinement stage. This is not massive innovation that has to happen, a massive breakthrough. It is now in refinement to get us to the point where, one, we will have many good attributes of this technology, but also we will be breaking crypto. So it's no surprise that all of these are in alignment as far as the guidance that current cryptography, wherever it is used, will be deprecated. And there is a mandate to transition every single system to post-quantum. And of course, that mandate is by 2035, again, as our firm deadline, but 2030 for various other aspects such as VPNs and certain other types of software. So it's approaching us very, very quickly, especially if you're looking at government acquisition point of view. And this applies to every system. I will note post-quantum is not a product. This is not something separate that we buy. Wherever you have in your system today, and frankly, we're all here because we care about security, you're using crypto somewhere. Whether that's code signing and updates, your software updates, or your MacBook, or your internet connections, it is everywhere, and all of that is being mandated to roll, which means we have no small challenge in front of us. But let's get ready for more. So, I mentioned the NIST process. We now have algorithms defined. This is the FIPS 203, 204, and 205 algorithms. Does that mean we're there yet? Is it just a matter of slotting these in, and then maybe getting accreditation, but slotting them in, and then we are post-quantum secure? Let's get a little bit of a deeper dive, shall we? Crypto systems aren't just algorithms. In fact, algorithms are what I fondly recall building blocks. So much like you do architecture today, using bricks, and then bricks are combined to build out walls, and walls are combined to build out bigger architecture. Same thing works in cryptography. We start with algorithms. That's your AES, your RSA, so forth. That's also these new NIST standards. They are algorithms. And then from those algorithms, we build out protocols. Protocols are also designed where the keys come from. They are the ones that assure resiliency against key compromise impersonation, freshness, and replay attacks. So many sorts of attacks. In fact, many of the attacks that we know today, adversaries will target the protocol because it's a lot easier to break a protocol than the algorithm. That includes all your TLS, SSH, and IPsec sessions. So in other words, this is affecting a lot of things. And then, building on that, we have the architectures. How do you combine those protocols to build out a bigger picture of security? You'll need your certificates. Are you using post-quantum keys in your certificates? Do they interoperate with the post-quantum keys that you're using in your protocols and in your algorithms? In those architectures, what is being protected? Often we protect voice and files and even chat differently. Every single type of thread data is often adapted a little bit. You'll notice that various end-to-end encrypted solutions today say things like end-to-end encrypted messaging. They allow you to attach a file, but they don't tell you the file is end-to-end encrypted. There's a reason for that. Because when we talk about the big picture of security, we have to be very precise about what is being protected and when. So when we talk about quantum resilience, the whole thing is affected. We now have algorithms, but we have a whole process, including all of your systems, that will need a transition to a bigger picture. And of course, weaknesses can occur anywhere, even assuming we have perfectly good algorithms. So let's start with there. Assuming we have perfectly good algorithms, the protocol can break. You can build a bad protocol out of good algorithms. You can also build bad architecture that will break out of perfectly good protocols. Well, we have certainly seen this happen before. Which means we start having to be very careful how we combine things. And when we talk about looking at the crypto that's used in your system, it's not simply a name anymore. It's not saying, do I use AES? It's not saying, oh, I use RSA. How is RSA implemented? What protocol is being used with that? What types of certificates? Now, I mentioned that there's the NIST-approved algorithms. The NIST-approved algorithms, if I'm to weigh into my analogy here a little bit, actually don't look like this. They look like this. So these building blocks are different than all the previous algorithms that we have seen before. Why are they different? Well, instead of having just one set way of doing things, now sometimes it's the ciphertext is larger or the key space is larger. Excuse me, not the key space, but the signature size or how long it takes to generate something. All the computation and the bandwidth costs are different, and sometimes you have trade-offs. Are you willing to take more storage in exchange for not having such constraints on your bandwidth, or are you going to take on more bandwidth constraints in exchange for having a limited storage? So now we have a lot of decision points. It's not simply one slot-in solution. There might be a couple slot-in solutions, ones that will work better or differently for each use case. And as you may guess, being a little bit of a different algorithm means we can't simply slot this into the protocols and architectures that we had before. We have to redesign our protocols. That is a certainty. There is no question of it. And many processes are ongoing today, for example, in the IETF, to look at a post-quantum version of TLS or post-quantum version of IPsec. So it means redesigning how we do the architectures. So to answer the question, are we there yet? Not quite. In fact, there's many decisions that all of you will have to make across many systems where there will be trade-offs. And to make this more interesting, we need to, I'm going to quote the special ops here and say we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Because one solution fits all is no longer the case either. There are many vendors out there who are working on some excellent post-quantum designs. Focus on industry solutions and the average user, not necessarily focus on defense. But they're doing good stuff for the average user. They're doing good architectures that would fit the other cases. Not unlike how we look at architectures in defense and engineering in defense, how there's a difference because of the use case difference. The same thing goes in security and in cryptography. Again, it used to be something off the shelf. Now it's something that we customize. There are options. Those trade-offs are going to come with a price. So for example, if I'm looking at some of the designs out there today, they're going to assume that you have a reliable network. They're going to assume reliable connectivity and not a DDoS environment. They're going to assume plenty of computation power. They're going to assume that you can easily roll and update algorithms and software, maybe something that we've found a challenge of now and then in defense in some of our deployment cases. And if I look at updating an internet connection or web server, that's going to look very different than if I have to roll software in a satellite or on board a ship. And so when we look at how this new crypto is fitting in and the protocols we're designing, we need to fit it to the use case. So it's not simply a question of, are we doing PQC? It's a question of, are you doing PQC for defense? Here's a sort of I'll say a short roadmap or a sort of suggestion list. It's a little bit easier if you're looking from a vendor point of view or if you're looking within a command in a particular system and saying, what should I be doing right now? Well, the very first thing, and this is also in line with what you see across the guidances coming out of DISA and CISA, for example, you need to start with an inventory. You need to know where the crypto is being used in your system. What sorts of algorithms? But, as we just saw, it's not just the algorithms. What sorts of protocols? Where are things? And then, of course, we need to prioritize. What's the thing that has to be rolled first? Is it the code signing, because we don't want a quantum adversary to attack that, and it's going to be lasting longer, and so forth. So, inventory, and then investigation for the use need. How is the system intended to function? What is it intended to interoperate with? Long term, if I'm going to go cross-service, how is that intended to interoperate? And are we prepared that the algorithms and protocols are set up in the same way that they can talk to each other? And then, of course, decisions, and I mentioned the priority, it's the data sensitivity. But it is also how long it will take to replace, to roll this. If I'm, again, running a web server, maybe I can have the algorithm there as strictly post-quantum, and if something went wrong, I will just roll that algorithm later. And it's easy to do. In fact, this happens with some of the stuff that we have out today in just standard crypto. We'll have backup plans with 2 types of algorithms in play, and you can flip the switch between them. But again, if I have something that's harder to replace or harder to update or more remote, then I need to take that into account. It's not simply the data sensitivity, but it's how long is it going to take me to change out this crypto if something goes wrong. And that's where agility starts coming into play. You might have heard the term cryptographic agility a lot, and that's saying, do you have a backup plan? Thankfully, or challengingly, we're now in the age where we don't just start with one plan and cross our fingers and hope that that will work indefinitely, because we know the adversaries out there, we know what they're doing, and things will break. It's not a question of if, this is simply a question of when. So what is the backup plan? What will you roll to, and what is the timeline for that? What is it going to take? Can you deploy a system that has a couple algorithms in place where one is the main, and if something goes wrong, it will roll to the other, for example? And of course, third-party vetting of solutions. And I can't stress this enough. That means vetting of the algorithms, vetting of the protocols. Now, thankfully, for many of us here, there's a lot on that front to inherit from. There have been many deep analyses of the algorithm in question. There are various analyses going on now with protocols with like a post-quantum TLS, and we can pull from that, rely on those. But if you have something that is proprietary or is not a standard, then it also needs analysis, and it needs a third-party analysis. When we talk about this, we talk about cryptographic and formal analysis, where we know the exact threat model under which it will hold and under which it will break. So, I have talked about some of the threats and challenges. I want to give you a flavor of what it really means for this variety of choices that's in front of us and where some of the trade-offs are. So I'm going to go through one case example. Get a sense of this. And the case example I'm going to look at is hybrid post-quantum. What does that mean? Well, the term hybrid is a little overused. We fully acknowledge this across the security community. But in this case, I'm talking about combinations of traditional crypto that's used in your devices today and the new post-quantum algorithms. Can we combine them? Well, why would we want to combine them? There's a couple of reasons. One, algorithms are fairly new. And like I said, we need to be planning for when things go wrong and not simply crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. So, in that sense, these post-quantum algorithms are fairly new. There will be further analysis as things go on, potentially weakening of them. Maybe not a catastrophic attack, but do we have a backup plan? And what post-quantum hybrid is talking about is if we combine this with the traditional, then that traditional provides a lower bound. In other words, I know that a traditional computer isn't going to be able to attack this no matter what happens, and the post-quantum algorithm is hopefully giving us that post-quantum security. And it takes very little cost to combine them both. Once you've rolled to post-quantum, it's very little extra cost to do both in terms of network or bandwidth. So that's one reason. Another reason, though, that we have seen grown out more recently is efficiency, believe it or not. Why efficiency? Well, your standard crypto today is more efficient than your post-quantum will be. So what if I could amortize the costs of post-quantum? And in combining this with the traditional, I can, instead of doing post-quantum all the time, I can put it into essentially my key pool, and then all my sessions, even if they're instantiated more in a standard way, can inherit that. So in bandwidth-constrained environments and lightweight environments, this might actually be a way to transition to post-quantum while dealing with the constraints of the environment. Okay, well, those are some interesting trade-offs. How do we do this? Let's give a few examples. I could, for instance, issue a new certificate that has a public key that is post-quantum as well as one that is traditional. So this is a certificate binding. Of course, I don't necessarily have to have that. I could have a post-quantum certificate and a standard certificate separately. That would be a policy binding. Over here, even assuming I have the two keys, does that mean I have two signatures back-to-back, so my post-quantum and my traditional signature? So just two algorithms, each signing this document? Or do I fuse them? If I fuse them in such a way that they're entangled, now I have an algorithm binding. Okay, so we have policy binding, certificate binding, algorithm binding, and this, by the way, goes not just for signatures, but also for key encapsulation and so forth. I could also bind at the protocol level. So this is an illustration of the TLS key schedule. What you have here on the right is your traditional TLS, and you have key shares. Those are just regular standard traditional ones. And then over here would be an example version of TLS where you have a hybrid, and you have key shares from both your post-quantum and your standard, and you combine them. So now we have a protocol binding. Well, that sounds like a few ways to bind things, doesn't it? So hybrid, do I bind in the policy? Do I bind in credentials? Do I bind in protocols, or do I bind in algorithms? And if you start putting your combinatorics hat on, you might start thinking, that sounds like a lot of options. And you'd be right. Now, among these different options for binding, some are terribly insecure. Some are very secure. And you have everything in between. You also have differences for each use case. Some of these will not work well for a bandwidth-limited environment. Some will be awesome and help us deploy post-quantum more swiftly. And that's just one case of the types of choices I have available. Now let's look at one of those bandwidth-limited environment solutions. So this is one of the bindings at a protocol level, which I might also bind with certificates. Here, I mentioned briefly before, I can set up a post-quantum channel. I can then set up my standard channel, and I'll use an exporter key injection. What does that do? Well, now I'm putting post-quantum keying material into my traditional keying material whirlpool, mixing them together. And then all my messages that are sent here will inherit post-quantum for both confidentiality and authenticity if I'm using an AAD, asymmetric key authenticity. And then I can also do that for future sessions again and again. This I have set up once. Maybe I will do that once a week. Maybe I do that once a month. Do I really expect the quantum attacker to be trying to use the quantum computer against my thing every single day? Or is it they're going to try to do it months worth of data at a time? In which case I can begin amortizing the costs of this by using this key injection. And I have all my freshness and other types of attacks prevented in that side. So that's one illustration. And again, this is going to be more applicable to things that are very bandwidth constrained. It would not be applicable as much if you're talking about internet connections, because that has to be stateless, and this is a very stateful protocol. So, in summary, we have an impending challenge. In fact, it's not impending, it's already here, and it has been here. We are going to deal with the risk, we will be facing the fallout in the future, but it's already happening now. Thankfully, guidance is also lining up on this, that we have a mandate to roll, so that we are hardened against the quantum adversary. But that in itself also means action on our part, and it's going to take effort and it's going to take time. And it will touch every single system. All of our systems use security in some respect. All of that cryptography will be rolling. And there is not a single vendor in this building that will not be affected by this. But thankfully, we also have an opportunity, both when we talk about cryptographic agility and better fitting our security to the use case environment. Back in the day, we had one way of doing crypto. It was off the shelf and we plugged it in. We're all familiar with saying AES 256. Familiar with RSA. Now there's a few ways, and we can be more customized to the environment to get better functionality. It's not simply security anymore. This actually enables the functionality you need. So there's an opportunity if we're willing to lean into it. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hale. Questions from the audience? Check in the chat. I have a couple questions. You talked about workforce, and I know you're a professor at NPS, and you teach this at NPS to students there?
Correct, yes. So we look at post-quantum transition and strategy, and that touches not simply as a detailed technical approach, but as a bigger picture of what you plan when. Take a given system, how are you going to combine it in? And what do you choose? And how do you plan out your timeline? There's going to be priority pieces to roll. Of course, all this takes costs, so that's going to be part of your plan as well. And it's a constraint that you have to factor in. So now we have multiple factors in the management of this. And people need to be cognizant of all pieces. It's not simply an engineering question, and it's not simply a management question. And how do we plan?
What about potential use cases for Navy and Marine Corps?
Oh, fantastic. So I mentioned this a type of combiners with hybrid. I think that these are going to be very beneficial to many of our use cases, especially when we're talking satellites and drones, a shipboard where we have more constrained settings and we have funneled data through very tight funnels. This is where we can actually customize and get some very elegant defense solutions that may not be deployed in your common messaging application. So the good news is, speaking of messaging applications, if you use something like iMessage, I could ask for a raise of hands, but I'm assuming we're all here because we're interested in security. But if you use iMessage today, or if you use the Signal application today, you are using post-quantum. That did not require you to install a quantum computer at your home. It is lightweight. It is on a mobile device. These things are very feasible, and they can be very quickly integrated, potentially, into your systems. So it's not the horrible hurdle that sometimes the word quantum presents in our mind. It's very doable. But when we start talking into defense, that's where we have to be extra careful that we're deploying the right thing, because some of the off-the-shelf solutions that we're seeing in a wide industry, or what we might consider a core cloud that I might connect to here in a stable environment, isn't going to work very well once we start talking about connecting edge devices. But the good news is when we look at that and say, you know what, these devices can be stateful. You have many more options of how to combine algorithms and protocols in an interesting cryptographic way that gives you added benefits.
So maybe a simpler question, where do you think we are in the process of quantum adoption for actual military use cases? Are we crawl, walk, run? Where are we at?
I was about to say that we're fresh out of the birth canal, but it didn't seem like something
That's
to say
okay.
here.
Just wanted to get a baseline assessment here.
So we are very much in a challenge point. We are nowhere near even crawling, from what I'm seeing. And part of it is that today, when we look at defense, and we look at Navy, Marine Corps, it is not simply the services. Industry itself is also a component of this alliance, of this work, and how we move forward into it. And so that means that on our side, we're looking at the acquisitions and sometimes implementation itself. And also we're reliant on the industry partners, and if they're moving and can move quickly, and which ones can move quickly. Hardening is beyond important for what's up against, what we're going to be up against. But we are seeing that many people are waiting on guidance. They're waiting to even begin looking at roadmaps until there is a guidance statement. And of course, assuming that the guidance statement came out tomorrow, and we began road mapping for the next year, and then began testing within a year or two after that, and then did acquisitions and accreditation, we're very quickly getting beyond the 2030 deadline for deprecation of the current algorithms, which means all of us are now in a race together.
Question from the Teams audience. Is Naval Postgraduate School working with NAV Air Weapons Division on quantum initiatives?
Good question. So, and this is an interesting aspect across the different warfare centers on what's happening with quantum. As I pointed out at the beginning, there's a difference between quantum and quantum technologies and making them in our current systems quantum resilient. Quantum resilience is about defending our systems against a quantum adversary. So there is potential, of course, there's many gains to be had from quantum technologies, but when we're talking this space, when we're talking about the quantum adversary and hardening all of our systems today, it is a very different set of skills. And as people working in security and cybersecurity, it's not related to, as a core to physics in any way. So when we're talking about innovation, these are two separate groups. If they're the same group, then you don't have the skills you need. So these are two separate groups. One is on the cybersecurity and the cryptography, and the other one is developing out those other quantum technologies.
Another question. What kind of tools would be used to test and validate PQC implementations?
Great. When we talk about cryptography, there are a few layers to worry about. Of course, there's the algorithms and analysis. Then there's the protocols. When we talk about protocol analysis, there are two main ways of analyzing. One what we call computational analysis, that's your more mathematics-based analysis, and that's frankly the more thorough analysis. It's like taking a picture and seeing an area of it in very fine detail, but you might not see the whole picture, so you might need to have several of these analyses. There's also automated tools, which we call symbolic analysis. It's really looking for logical fallacies, and that's like looking at a picture and seeing the whole picture heavily pixelated. So you see the whole thing, but you don't see a lot of detail about the security. And these are often complementary. It's not a choice of one or the other. We really want them both. So that's when we talk about algorithms and protocols in particular, definitely the protocols and systems. Those are the sorts of ways we analyze. Then, of course, you get into a systems analysis. There's a lot of pieces here that need to work together. Your certificates, how you combine and store those, how you run the protocols, where you do user authentication. Are you using a PAKE, or are you using hashes? PAKE being the better password authenticated key agreement, which is a better way. So there's various ways of combining these into a system. Some of those will use the same analysis methods. Some of those will need to take a more systems engineering picture of where an attack will work through a system, and can you stop it? So, and then of course you get into the software analysis, and then that can go into two areas of software analysis. One is your basic, did I program things securely, and is my code good? And that's your classic fuzzing in software analysis. But there's also the question of, did I implement it according to the standard? Because I could implement the wrong thing that is implemented in a perfectly good way. But there's the flaw in how it's implemented over here. So for example, in your classic signature schemes, even if you look today at like ECDSA, it will generate a one-time key during a signature process. If you reuse that one-time key ever, you will literally leak your sign-in key, and I can sign anything on your behalf. So it's very important that that doesn't happen. But if I just do the fuzz testing of software, I will not detect whether or not that has been programmed in that way. So these are two areas of the software analysis that will need to take place.
Awesome. Questions? Dr. Hale, thank you very much.
Certainly.
Thanks so much. Thank you. So we have a bit of a drawn out schedule. What I thought we might try to do is try to accelerate if we have any of our speakers in the room. Do we have any speakers for this afternoon in the room? We do? Dr. Tasinski. Yes. So perfect. NIWC Pacific, Quantum Information Processing Technology at NIWC Pacific. Okay. How about a 5-minute break and then we'll kick off? Thank you.